In the Bible, we understand that everything ultimately points to the person and work of Christ. The Old Testament is laden with shadows, pointing forward to the substance which is Christ. The saints of old only saw glimpses and broad brushes of the overall picture of redemption. Stories of a cross that healed, blood that saved, an object that reunites heaven to earth, and a man who delivers us from destruction. Now we, who can see the completed work, see that the substance is here. His work is done.
For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. In the year 4 BC, Bethlehem was a city in turmoil. Roman soldiers patrolled the troubled streets. Throngs of citizens spilled into the village, overfilling the taverns and guest rooms. The greeting Mary and Joseph encountered upon entering the town was far from peaceful. Yet in this blustering chaos, the author of humanity would speak restoration, delivering the infant Savior to the young mother. Those tiny hands would one day bear a Roman spike. Those small shoulders would soon carry the enormous weight of mankind's treachery. And through this birth, this life, the sin-bearer would bring peace to his people. Today we strike our fourth flame in this Advent season, lighting what has been called the candle of the angels. It reminds us of the glad tidings declared by the heavenly messengers on that first Christmas day. Glory to God in the highest, and on earth, peace to those with whom he is pleased. In a world of division, chaos, and war, may Paul's prayer for the Romans be true in our souls today. May the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace as you trust in him, so that you may overflow with hope by the power of the Holy Spirit. Please join me in prayer. Dear God, as the kings and rulers of our world are enthroned, we have witnessed the elaborate preparations made for those events. By the power of your Spirit, move us to make the preparations needed to welcome you, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. Soften our hearts. Break down our resistance. Open us anew to your life and love that we may be transformed and may be agents of transformation in the lives of others. For Jesus' sake, amen.
You guys done. All right, if you got a Bible, go ahead and grab it. We're in the prophecy of Daniel chapter 3 this morning. Daniel 3. We're exploring together over these few weeks leading up to Christmas during this season that we call Advent. It has historically been known as the season of Advent in the Christian church for about the last 1,600 years, a season where we prepare our hearts for the arrival of Christ and all that that meant in his first coming, and where we prepare our souls and our hearts for all that it will mean at his second coming, when he'll come back to set all things right and make all things new. And so as a way for us to center our hearts and our souls and our affections throughout this season, we've been exploring from the Old Testament the concepts, the truth that all of this, from Genesis to Malachi, points toward the coming Messiah, and not just the Messiah as a concept, but the Messiah as reality fulfilled in the person and the life and the work, the death and the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. And so we began the series in Luke 24, the post-risen Christ, where we have Jesus on the road to Emmaus telling his disciples and telling us that all of the Old Testament, all the scriptures, Moses and the prophets, they all point to him. And we kind of took an aerial view of that in the first week and saw from Genesis through Deuteronomy, from Joshua through the prophets, how all of this points toward Jesus in snapshots. And then a couple weeks ago, our feet hit the ground there in the really the 19th century BC, almost 4,000 years ago, and we saw Jacob, and we saw through Jacob and his dream and the ladder stretching into heaven, how Christ is prophesied, predicted, and promised through these types and symbols and patterns in the Old Testament. How all the different characters and all the different events and all the different objects point to the perfection of the coming Savior. And then last week, we explored together the prophecies. All of these promises etched throughout Old Testament history over the course of a couple thousand years that predict exactly with specific detail what Messiah would do, who Messiah would be, and how Jesus fulfilled those. But today we arrive upon the third of the primary ways in which we see Jesus in the Old Testament, and I think it speaks to us in ways that none of the others do. And this is what is known as Christophanies. A Christophany in the Old Testament is when the pre-incarnate, so before he became flesh, the pre-incarnate second member of the Trinity would show up in human history to be seen, to be conversed with, to be experienced, to be felt. And there are a few different instances of this in the Old Testament, but probably the most famous of these instances is found here in the third chapter of the book of Daniel. So we're going to explore together. If you've been with us for several years now, you know we've been in this text once before, but it's about 7 years ago, and so I doubt you remember. All right, so Daniel chapter 3. Now, just to set the stage for us so that we're kind of tracking with where the story, it's a narrative, so where's the story going, is a true account that happened at the close of the 7th century. Nabopolassar is the king in Babylon. He's a mighty king. He's kind of unrivaled at that point in time in his fame and in his power and his prestige. His kingdom is expanding, mostly due to the fact that he has a son, a warrior prince named Nebuchadnezzar, who is leading the Babylonian forces against the surrounding nations and conquering as he goes. In 606 BC, Nebuchadnezzar, at the behest of his father, travels to Egypt. And there he wages war against Pharaoh Necho. Now, if you're a Bible student, you might remember Pharaoh Necho. He was responsible in battle for the death of one of the few godly kings in the nation of Judah's history, Josiah. And so when Josiah dies in battle at the hands of Pharaoh Necho, Josiah's son, Jehoiakim, is lifted to the throne. Now, Jehoiakim does not share the adoration of Jehovah that his father had experienced and had practiced. And as a matter of fact, Jehoiakim is an absolutely wicked, deplorable king. And so he's reigning there in Judah, the kingdom of Judah, in southern Israel, while Nebuchadnezzar is waging war against Pharaoh Necho. Nebuchadnezzar wins, puts Egypt in submission to the empire of Babylon, and begins to return home. And on his way back home in 606, he comes across this kind of little podunk village, so to speak, this podunk nation or kingdom of Judah. Insignificant to him, but he says, hey, we've conquered Egypt, we've conquered other nations, why not go ahead and subject Judah to our rule? It was a very short-lived battle. Jehoiakim the king surrenders almost right away to Nebuchadnezzar. And as Nebuchadnezzar is riding into Jerusalem, having conquered the city, he receives word that his father, Nabopolassar, has died in Babylon. In antiquity, when a king died, if the heir was not present, the throne was vacant, all types of sedition and insurrection would take place. And so Nebuchadnezzar, according to Jewish history, grabs a few of the noble princes and princesses of Jerusalem and carts them back as insurance, really, to keep Judah subjected to Babylon, carts them back, these nobles, to Babylon. Among them are 4 young men who we become familiar with here in the pages of this prophecy: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Now, most scholars conclude, because it's an argument from silence, because no other of the nobility are mentioned, the other young men and young women from Judah who were carted to Babylon, that all of them, most likely, with the exception of these 4 men, compromise. They assimilate to the culture. After all, everyone's doing it. You've been displaced from home. You've seen your king defeated. You'll never see home again. You'll never see your family again. A lot of scholars conclude that when the women are brought in, they're immediately placed oftentimes in the harem of the king, the harem of Nebuchadnezzar. And when the young men are brought in, so as not to produce offspring and produce ultimately an insurrection, they would be castrated before being put in the service of the king. So this is most likely what's taken place. They're brought into this godless culture where there is no reverence for Yahweh, where the objects of worship in the temple are now going to be desecrated in Babylon. Their identity is changed. They're given new names. Each of these men's names, if you study them in Hebrew, carries with it the idea of Yahweh is the deliverer, or who is like Elohim. But as soon as they're brought into Babylon, Daniel's given the name Belshazzar, and Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah are given these names that emerge for us in Daniel chapter 3, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these are all names that promote allegiance to, reverence, honor directed at the Babylonian gods, particularly Nego, the god of the moon, and Aku, the god of war. And so they begin to grow up there. They're about 16 at the beginning of this story. So you can imagine a sophomore in high school and what it would be like to be removed from their culture, removed from their family, removed from their church, removed from their influences, and thrust into a foreign country, a godless kingdom, given new names, expected to conform to society. And it becomes a miracle that even 4 of them remain faithful. Now you move into Daniel chapter 2, and King Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. In this dream, he sees a statue, and he doesn't understand the interpretation. So when he wakes up, he calls his magicians and sorcerers and all the crunchy people of the kingdom together. And he asks them, hey, what does this mean, this dream? And they can't explain, they can't interpret what the dream means. And so finally he says, let's give the Hebrew fellows a try. So he calls Daniel, most likely the 3 Hebrew children with him. And he asks Daniel, Daniel says, let me go back and pray about this and try to uncover what this means. And so he comes back to Nebuchadnezzar. Ultimately, he gives him the interpretation of the dream. And even though Nebuchadnezzar doesn't necessarily like the interpretation of the dream and decides he's going to try to alter prophecy, and we'll get into what that interpretation was here in a second, he still promotes Daniel and Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah to prominent places in his kingdom. Ultimately, he leaves again. There's about a 5-year gap between Daniel chapter 2 and Daniel chapter 3. And Nebuchadnezzar, because a rebellion has arisen in Egypt, he travels to Egypt to put down this rebellion, and he's actually defeated there in battle. And he has to run back home. He goes to Judah on his way home. Judah has decided, because, hey, Egypt was successful in their rebellion, we will rebel as well. And during that rebellion, Jehoiakim dies, and the people of Judah, great reverence for their king, according to Jewish history, catapult their king out of the city to say, hey, you win, we give up. And Nebuchadnezzar subjects Judah once again and brings even more nobility back with him to Babylon. And when we arrive in Babylon, clearly a building project has been underway. Nebuchadnezzar's famous throughout history for the hanging gardens of Babylon, which he constructed, for other architectural achievements. But here he builds a statue on the plain of Dura. And this is where we pick up on the story now. King Nebuchadnezzar, this mighty king, this known king, this honorable, glorious sovereign, and yet he's recently been defeated in battle. He's recently received a dream that he does not like the interpretation of this prophecy. And so what does he do? Well, I think he reacts a lot like we would. Verse 1, chapter 3. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold. So we get a little picture into this right away. Almost all scholars conclude that this is none other than, this is a Babylonian king, generally speaking, but most likely it is a very specific Babylonian king, Nebuchadnezzar. So he builds this image of gold, overlaid in gold from head to toe, whose height was 60 cubits, that's about 90 feet tall, and its breadth 6 cubits, about 10 feet wide. He set it up on the plain of Dura, and archaeology has confirmed this, as it often does in the Old Testament. There have been remnants of this very statue, of the pedestal that it would have set upon, found on the plain of Dura near modern day Baghdad. in the province of Babylon. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent to gather the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. The who's who of Babylonian society. This is the VIP list. He knows, and we understand this today as well. That's why it's done so prolifically. That if you can get the influencers together and get them on the same page, they can shift the culture. They can instruct the people on who to worship. And so he gets all the influencers together. Verse 3. Then the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces, including Daniel and Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah, they come together to the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So we cannot miss the awkwardness here. All right, the king has just been defeated in battle. He's received a dream. He probably hasn't let the cat out of the bag and told very many people about this dream. And in order to thwart this prophecy, in order to kind of push forward his prominence and his glory, he constructs a statue. Now, just imagine with me that you come in this morning, you park in the front lot, and you're walking up to the building, and there's this taller than the building. We have a 2-story building here, so 9 stories tall. There's a statue, and it's me. Overlaid in gold, spotlight shining up, 8-pack abs, sword in one hand, Bible in the other. Like that's, it's me. And you're starting to walk up, and our greeter's like, hey, good morning, welcome to Building 28. Can you just kneel here before you come in? Now, we won't go on with this because it's just awkward for all of us, right? And no one would do that in our day. We're like, this is so weird, Nebuchadnezzar, but we have to understand, contextually, this wasn't that odd for the citizens of Babylon. Maybe because their king has just been defeated. Maybe he's tasted humiliation. But he sets this up, he says, hey, come to this ceremony. We're going to dedicate a statue in honor and worship of me. We're like, that's so weird. And yet, if we can be honest, we do the same thing on Instagram and Facebook. We just do. Like, look at how glamorous my life is. Look at how much money I make. Look at how much fun I'm having. Look at how great I am. Look how important I am. Honor me. Envy me. Not you guys, just Thursday at 11:15. But we do this. We have a lot in common with these. Like I mentioned this in the 2 weeks ago when I talked about Jacob. But Christians, by and large, I mean, no matter how shoddy of a Christian we are, we love to identify ourselves with the mighty in the Old Testament. Look at how awesome David was. I'm just like David. I'm slaying all these giants in my life. When in reality, we identify most, if we're just honest, I think it's a good place to be, is honest this morning, we identify with the shoddy in the Old Testament, with the arrogance. I mean, we live in this incredibly arrogant culture today, and they were living in this culture then. And they understood, don't miss this, it's not just Nebuchadnezzar who's arrogant. Yeah, he builds a statue 100 feet tall, overlaid in gold. Look at my glory, look at my prominence, look at who I am. But also all the people who bow and worship of this object only do so that their lives should continue in the fame and prosperity and recognition that they enjoy. And we do that today. Even if we're like, I don't care about people worshiping me, we will still worship the false gods of our society so that our lives remain peaceable. It's what we do. So, they all gathered together, and they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And the herald proclaimed, verse 4, aloud, you are commanded, all peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down, just so we're clear, because I know there's people from all these different nations who have been suppressed. So if you don't want to fall down and worship, just so the warning is apparent for you, you shall immediately be cast into a burning, fiery furnace. Now, this would have been something that all the nobility of Babylon are familiar with. Archaeologists have also discovered all of these furnaces used for forging metals across the Babylonian Empire during the height of their architectural reign. And so they say, hey, we have this furnace here on the plain of Dura, most likely used in the construction of the statue. It has an open top, that's where we drop the metal in, and then there's an open cavern at the bottom. We can see the metal and then extract it with tools when it's necessary. And if you don't bow down and worship according to the gods of this culture, you don't serve and honor this God and the Babylonian gods, then you're going to be cast into a furnace of fire. Cancel culture at its best, okay? And so, what happens? A lot of us know this because we grew up in the church. But if I can just be honest, I don't think the flannel graph depicts it really well. and for those who don't know that, like the Veggie Tales, like whatever it is, we just don't do a very good job of representing the horror and terror of this scene. Bow down and worship the Babylonian king, or you're going to be tossed into the furnace of fire. So, verse number 6, and whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. Verse 7, therefore, as soon as all the people heard the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, all the peoples, all the nations, every language fell down and worshiped the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. This refrain is repeated over and over. The musical instruments used and all the different people who would gather here. And I think the reason for this is just to remind us that everyone is doing it. This is the easy thing to do. It's just easy. Just bow down. I mean, even if you don't mean it, just bow down, pay reverence. Like, it's all good. Justify it however you need to justify it. But verse number 8. Therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward, malicious, and accused the Jews. So they come forward most likely because Daniel and Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah have been promoted to these prominent positions in Babylon. They're jealous. And so they maliciously accused the Jews. And what they accused them of was not false. They sought, don't miss this, they sought to inflict harm through relaying what was true but didn't need to be relayed. So I think we could learn from that as well, because so many people today are like, well, I wouldn't say it if it's not true. And I don't know if we should say a lot of times, even if it is true, especially if there's malicious intents. But these Chaldeans declared to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. You, O king, notice how they continue to puff him up. You made a decree, not us, you did this, that every man who hears the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into a burning fiery furnace. And whoever, there are certain Jews, verse 12, whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon. Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, who is, what a coup is, command of Nego. These are young men. They've been named after the Babylonian gods, but clearly their allegiance isn't to you. Like, we've done our best to conform them, to assimilate them, but still they refuse to worship you. And you've commanded them. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. If you want to offend a narcissist, that's what you say. They pay no attention to you. You're not the center of attention. You're not the center of their adoration. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in furious rage, how dare they not worship me, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. So they brought these men before the king. And Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, hey, listen up. Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? And then, like a true narcissist, he doesn't even allow them to respond. Now, look, it was cute. Out on the plains of Dura, when like your friends are watching and they're like, hey, you know what? We really admire you. Like, look at your stand, your courage. We'll come with you to church now. That was cute. But now you're here before the king. The fiery furnace is right there. Now, if you are ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, to fall down and worship the image that I made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. And I have a question for you. What God is going to deliver you from that? No God. That's impossible. I am the king over all the earth. I get my way. And you can almost imagine that Nebuchadnezzar is giving the order to strike up the band again. When Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they weren't really given an audience, they just took advantage of the opportunity. Oh, Nebuchadnezzar, we don't even need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. This is modern day. This is a viral moment on social media. They just stood up to the king. Look at them. This is amazing. He can deliver us. He will deliver us. But hey, listen, Nebuchadnezzar, it's important that you understand, even if he doesn't deliver us, and that's significant. Because they believed they had trust in the Lord that he could do it. They even had trust here that he would do it, one way or another. But if he doesn't, we trust him that his way is perfect. We just need to make you aware, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Just FYI. Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury. I love this. And the expression of his face was changed. Have you ever seen somebody that's gotten so angry, so offended, or maybe you've looked in the mirror and seen it for yourself, that their entire face is distorted. You're like, who is that? That's not even a human anymore. That's Nebuchadnezzar here. It's changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So he ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated. So just so we're clear, there wasn't a thermometer on the side where they were saying, okay, there it is, 7 times. Basically what this means here in the language of antiquity is as hot as it could possibly be heated. Like fire it up. So much so that as soon as they're dropped into this from the top, they're going to disintegrate. They're going to melt. There'll be no more. No one is going to offend me and get away with it. I get my way. I get my worship. And he's just barking out orders here, barking out commands, supposes that he's the sovereign, that he's in control. He ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were chained up, bound in their cloaks, tunics, their hats, and their other garments. They don't really need to be, if you think about this. They're about to be dropped into a furnace, heated as hot as it possibly can. There's no need to really bind them up. So this is more so a show of his strength than it is practical. Like, watch what I'm going to do. They're subjected. They're bound up. They're in chains. Now, throw them in. Because the king's order was urgent, and the furnace overheated, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And I think it's important to point out here that typically, we just learn this practically from the story, typically our arrogance weakens us. That's what it does for the king here. He loses mighty men in his army because of his own narcissism, his own pride. And those 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, fell bound into the burning fiery furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished, and he rose up in haste, and he declared to his counselors, "Did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire?" And they answered the king, and they said, "Sure did." That's the actual Hebrew translation. And he answered and said, "Behold, I see 4 men unbound. There's no fetters on them anymore. And they're walking around in the middle of the fire. And they are not hurt. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods." Now, once again, if we Sunday school this version, Nebuchadnezzar's like, Jesus, he's there. But if we're speaking reality in accord with history, Nebuchadnezzar doesn't know. He doesn't care about the gods of the Egyptians, the gods of the Persians, the gods of the Jews. He doesn't care about these foreign gods. He cares about himself. So he doesn't know, most likely, the prophecies concerning Messiah. He certainly doesn't know the name Yeshua. And so all he can utter there is, this is miraculous. This is magnificent. Like, look, there's someone else. There's 4 people in the fire walking around unbound, unhurt, and one looks like deity. Now, most of the scholars have concluded that this is none other than a very Christophany. We can't be completely sure, but this is almost certainly Jesus appearing, pre-incarnate, second member of the Trinity, appearing with his children in the fire. Years ago now, 2012, my wife and I went with a couple of friends of ours to Alaska. And Jenny, who's up here, she was singing this morning, she went with us on the trip. She remembers this well, where we head to Alaska, we go on a cruise, we come back to Seattle, and we have a couple extra days, and so we decided to go up to Vancouver. And so we cross the Canadian border, go up to Vancouver, see the city. It's not that great, actually. And then on the way back, if I'm honest, on the way back, we're going through customs, and my wife, pre-children, was always so fun. I mean, she's still fun, but just didn't have a care in the world. She just didn't have a care in the world. And I've always been a more uptight, kind of nervous one. And so we're going through customs, and I've been through customs many, many times. And I'm like, hey, look, I know the ritual. You just be nice, be serious, give them what they want, don't goof off. And Daniel's kind of goofing around the back of the van, like doesn't care. And so our friend who's driving hands the customs officer all of our passports. And we're sitting there for a while. I think it's gonna be easy. We're just gonna cruise right back across and head to Seattle. We're sitting there for a while, and then all of a sudden, you start to see in the side view mirrors, you start to see coming around the front 5 or 6 custom officers, and no joke, their hands are on their pistols as they're approaching our van. I'm like, what is up? What has my wife done now? And so they extract us from the van. They put us in this little holding room. We don't know what's going on. My wife and I have been married for a few years up to this point, but she still had her passport from just before we got married. And so her name read Jessica Danielle Smith, born September 16th, 1986. And finally, a custom officer comes out and says, hey, look, I have to inform you, we saw this Jessica Danielle Smith, born 9/16/86. There is a Jessica Danielle Smith, born on September 16, 1986, who is a fugitive, wanted for armed robbery and kidnapping, and we just thought it was her. And I almost said, it probably is, but I didn't. We sat there they're like, but we have surmised based upon numerous factors that's not her. It was just a case of mistaken identity. So you're free to go back into the States now. And we left, and we've talked about it for years. We've joked about it. I've wondered. Not really. But here's the deal this morning. I think this is very important, really important. Mistaken identity that could have very easily had extreme and dire and catastrophic consequence. And this is something, if you've been at Building 28 for any length of time, you know this is something I harp on a lot. But I think especially here, and I know we're not really in the Bible Belt, we're south of the Bible Belt, and so it's kind of a post-Christian culture a lot here. But for us in the church, for people we know who would claim Christianity, that would claim allegiance to Jesus, I think what we do oftentimes is we look at Jesus, but we're not looking at the factual, legitimate, historical, biblical Jesus. We're really guilty of a case of mistaken identity. And hear me say this, like we don't like to hear this, but if the Bible is true, if Jesus is legit, which he is, and it is, then this will have dire, catastrophic consequence. What we do throughout the year, different times of the year, according to our personality and temperament, is we take certain versions of Jesus. Like we'll take, if I'm honest with you guys, I like the Jesus of Revelation 19. Mm-hmm. So it's true. Coming back on the white horse, tattoo on his leg. Okay, all the Baptists are offended, but he has a tattoo on his leg. Sword coming out of his mouth, King of kings, Lord of lords, trampling down his enemies, restoring justice. I like that Jesus. That speaks to me as a dude. And some of you are like, oh, that Jesus is cool, but hey, the lamb petting Jesus. Pretty, blue eyes, well-groomed beard. Like, that's my favorite. Or some of you are like Ricky Bobby in Talladega Nights, especially this time of year, and you're like, no, the 8-pound, 6-ounce baby Jesus. Like that's my, or whatever it might be. Like I think that's how we are. Even if we don't espouse that, we think of Jesus, we conjure up some image in our minds, and all of them to a certain extent are true oftentimes, but any of them in isolation is incomplete. It's incomplete. And as followers of Jesus, we need to have a good understanding of all that our King is. And I think this prophecy, written 600 years before Jesus would come on the scene, gives us a good indication of who Jesus is. So there's 3 things I'm gonna point out, and this is not comprehensive. He's much more. Jenny read this morning, Isaiah 9, he's the Prince of Peace, he's the mighty God, he's the everlasting Father. And so there's more that could be said, but there's 3 things I think that we see here that oftentimes are taken in isolation. The first is invincibility. And when we talk about this, we have to think of Nebuchadnezzar, because he believes himself to be in control, sovereign over the affairs of his life, sovereign over the affairs of his kingdom, worshiped by the people. He is invincible. And yet we clearly understand from history that he's not. He's been already defeated in battle. He will die. He'll be reminded for his garden. Remembered for his garden. Like that's less than impressive. Like none of us know about Nebuchadnezzar probably. We don't know outside of the book of Daniel what he was like, what he enjoyed. He's faded from memory. Not truly invincible. Is defeated, does die. And in this again, just like in his arrogance, we see a picture of ourselves. I consider myself a historian of sorts. Love to read about history. And one of the time periods, like many historians that I love, is that 1930s and 40s World War II era. Studying the greatest generation and all that they did in defeating Nazi Germany. But in studying that, it's impossible to really research and look into it without being introduced to the atrocities of World War II, and specifically those prison death concentration camps that were spread across the European theater. One of those, really the first of those, that was the model for all the others, was a camp called Dachau. It's near Munich in southern Germany. And Dachau was originally a prisoner of war camp, but then it became a concentration and a death camp for not only Jewish people, but all those who would help the Jewish people or all those who would resist the Nazi regime across Europe. They're brought to Dachau or one of the other prison camps. It's recorded that nearly 32,000 inmates at Dachau were put to death in the 1940s, and probably tens of thousands more that are undocumented. They had incredible torture procedures that were inflicted. We won't go into detail this morning, but it was a horrific place, and of course they had the infamous gas chambers there. At the entrance of Dachau, much like at the entrance of Auschwitz, which I've talked about before, there was this German phrase printed on the gate. I've got it up here on the slide for you this morning, and I won't humor you by trying to pronounce it. But in English, the interpretation is all the inmates walking past this, captives walking past this, entering the concentration camp would read it. Work sets you free. So if you want to be released, put your head down, submit, obey, work, strive, grind, it'll be good. Inside of Dachau, there's a museum, numerous pictures from the 1940s, and one of them is a young Jewish mother who is standing in line, her little girl in front of her, and the mother has her hands over the eyes of her little girl as they walk slowly into one of the gas chambers. It's horrific. It's weighty. It's ominous. And when I read that, without taking anything away from the brutalities of that moment, I look at it in correlation to our lives. And I truly believe that the best that we can do in a world that is broken, in a world that is heinous, in a world that is dark and bleak, the best we can do through all the forms of amusement we have is to proverbially put our hands over our eyes or our fingers in our ears and pretend that reality isn't reality. That's the best we can do. Because if we're honest, we're not capable, we're not invincible, we are not powerful enough to be our own saviors from this wreckage. And neither was Nebuchadnezzar. And clearly, neither were Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. But one shows up in the fire who removes the chains and begins to walk around unhurt, invincible. Nebuchadnezzar thinks that he's the invincible one until he comes face to face with the truly invincible one. And this is King Jesus. Now, don't get me wrong, in his humanity, clearly we understand this. He cried, and he suffered, and he endured pain, and he went to the cross. But he rises again, the New Testament records for us, and he is today and forevermore invincible. Amen. He can't be defeated, he can't be touched, he can't be killed. He was killed once, because his Father desired that to bring, as we talked about last week, restoration. Like, he could have existed forever, powerful, omnipotent, invincible, and yet he subjected himself. So in this first aspect of Christ coming in the fire to release his people, and so that his people will be unhurt and delivered from the fire, we understand that this is what our invincible God does. There's a lot talked about. We've mentioned it on the grace of God, the mercy of God, the forgiveness of God, the love of God, and that's all well and good, but love means nothing if the person who's loving you when you're in danger is incapable of saving you from that danger. They have to not only love and care and devote themselves to you, they have to be powerful in order to procure rescue, and that's what he does here. And so I just need us to understand this because someone was writing me last night, Friday night, actually, about the doctrine of the impassibility of God and asking questions about that on social media. It's a great place to ask those kind of questions. But I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the dialogue. And they're like, I'm trying to figure out God. And I'm like, good luck on that. You know, we do our best. But here's what I understand. God could, they say here, he can, he will, but even if he doesn't, God could deliver you from whatever it is that you're going through in your life right now. He could. So just want to throw this out there so you guys can grieve with me. This week, I took my kids on Tuesday afternoon to Busch Gardens. We rode a couple rides, saw some animals, and then we ended up at Elmo's place. And they're climbing through the maze, and they're jumping on this little yellow trampoline thing. And I'm just watching them, and I'm not unhappy because it's like 74 degrees out, which is a little warm for me this time of year, but whatever. But I'm in the shade, and there's this massive oscillating fan that is stationary that's blowing right on me. So I'm happy. It's about 10, 12 feet away. I'm happy until this woman, this lady, from England, apparently because of her accent, comes, lets her boys run, and then stands in front of the fan, blocking the flow and turning my Tuesday into a bad day. I don't think that's going to elicit a lot of sympathy, so we'll keep going. Also on Tuesday, I found out that we had severe plumbing issues in our new house. Surprise, surprise. Some be hundreds, thousands of dollars, whatever, I don't know. And still probably you're like, all right, whatever. I don't care. I'll pretend like I care. Because that's just life. Like, we're all hit with these things all the time, this heaviness all the time. We're besieged constantly with pain and suffering and darkness and bills and unwanted diagnoses all the time. And just to be clear this morning, I hate when Christians say, this is just my furnace. No, it's not. Like they didn't go into the furnace because life is tough. They went into the furnace because they refused to compromise their worship of Jehovah. So just so we're clear, whatever you're going through, most likely, whatever I'm going through is not my furnace. But it does suck. It's heavy. It's whether we're directly being persecuted for our love for Jesus, and some of you in some form might experience that over the holidays with family. Isolation, marginalization, ridicule. So whether it's that, or even just dealing with the terrors of life, clearly we understand as Christ followers that the invincible Messiah, risen and triumphant, could right now deliver us from all of this. We understand he could. We can agree with the Hebrew children. We also, if we're biblically literate, understand that most often he doesn't. Because as I mentioned in Collective a couple weeks ago, his cosmic purposes are so much more significant than our temporary pain. So we understand that, at least in part. We understand also that at the final restoration of all things, we will ultimately, fully, and finally be delivered from all of this that we suffer from now. Amen. But the word for us today, because we're not at the end yet, contrary to what some of you say, we're not at the end yet. So the word for us today is this. And this is, like, if you just read Daniel 3, this is why it's important that we're Bible students, because you read Daniel 3 in isolation, you're like, hey, whatever it is, I know I'm going through this furnace right now, but like he's going to come and he's going to deliver me from it. And he will ultimately. And he will deliver us, this is very important, he will deliver us from eternal damnation. Like he has delivered us from that. We celebrate that. But right now, in this moment, living in the effects of a broken world, a sin-saturated society, what we need to understand, what some of us need to hear this morning, is that Daniel 3 does not promise us right now, temporarily, that Jesus will come and he'll deliver you from whatever that proverbial fire is. But rather what the promise again and again and again is that Jesus comes to us and walks with us in the fire. Like he's there now for us. And some of us desperately need to hear it because we feel alone. We talked about last week. We love lying to ourselves. We love believing our feelings, but your feelings are lying to you. Like Jesus doesn't forsake those. In the fire, he's with them. I hate sorry, I know some of you have it in your home, but I hate the little like footprints in the sand thing. Like, okay? I get it. Like sometimes people are like, I wish you wouldn't say that. Now I have to like redecorate my home. But like the little footprints in the sand, here's why. If you're not familiar, there's these two footprints in the sand, Jesus walking along beside us, and all of a sudden there's only one footprint in the sand. And it seems like God is abandoned. And so the poet there says, oh, what happened in my tough moments is when there's only one footprint, Jesus left. And the response is, no, I didn't leave you. I carried you in those moments. And the reason I hate it is because it implies that in the good moments, Jesus doesn't carry us. There's only ever one set of footprints in the sand. Like our Redeemer, the invincible one, is always carrying us as people. He doesn't leave us as people. He's sheltering us, his people. So we see the invincibility here. But once again, just like love doesn't mean much if there's not might, might doesn't mean much if there isn't love. Who cares that Nebuchadnezzar is grand and powerful? He's not a benevolent, kind ruler. But Jesus is. So we see invincibility, but we also see remarkable intimacy here, where Jesus shows up. Don't miss this, because it's all contained here right in Nebuchadnezzar's phraseology. Behold, look, I see 4 men that are unbound, unhurt, invincibility, walking in the midst of the fire. Now we read that, I think, and we're like, oh, they're just kind of like strolling around, taking a jaunt. But in antiquity, whenever you read the word walk, not just in scripture, but in other ancient writings, it always carries with it, for its readers, a sense of purpose. You're going somewhere. You're not stationary. You see this even in Psalm 1 where it says, blessed is the man who does not walk, evil purpose, in the counsel of the ungodly. And so they're walking in the midst of the fire. And so we ask ourselves, commentators and scholars, theologians have asked themselves, what does this mean? And it's quite clear what it means. That the Hebrew children, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, who is like Elohim, none can save but Yahweh. This is the meaning of their Hebrew names. That they see in the fire the pre-incarnate, invincible Christ, and they are moving most likely toward him. But not only are they moving toward him, but he is moving toward them. Like the Son of God, present in the flames, walking, no hurt, Nebuchadnezzar says. The invincible one, the intimate one, remarkable intimacy. And then finally, we'll just kind of finish here this morning. We see immortality. And we already touched on this when we talked about invincibility. In Daniel chapter 2, this is significant. When Nebuchadnezzar has his dream, he dreams of a statue, and the head is made of gold, but the body, the torso, arms, legs are made of different elements. And so when Daniel gives him the interpretation of this dream, Daniel says, hey, look, the gold head of the statue, that's you, Nebuchadnezzar. That's the Babylonian Empire. It's beautiful. It is grand. It's expansive. But it's temporary. Eventually, your kingdom will disintegrate and you'll be overthrown. And that's the next, the shoulders and the arms and torso of the statue. You're gonna be overthrown. Your kingdom will not last forever. And so what does Nebuchadnezzar do? That sounds great. I'll worship Jehovah now. No, he decides to build a statue completely overlaid in gold. As if he is saying, my kingdom will last forever. My name will be preserved. I am the King of Kings. I am the Lord of Lords. I am the invincible, immortal one. And then he comes face to face with one whose appearance is that of divinity, who emerges from the fire, delivers his people from the fire, and gives to them, to us, immortality. We live in such a transient world that we forget this. We lose sight of this. I was in the car with my youngest two this week while Danielle was homeschooling my oldest. We came here to the church and hung out for a little while, and they were playing. I was doing some work, and then we're heading back home. Evie's 5, Augustin's 3. And while we're heading home, Evie decides she wants to ask me a question. And the question is, Daddy, do we live in Florida or do we live in the United States? I'm like, well, baby, it's both. The United States is the United States because Florida is a state and there's 50 of them and we're sort of united. And she's like, oh, okay. Which state does George Washington live in? I'm like, well, baby, George Washington's dead. She's like, oh, that's right. Like Abraham Lincoln. And then she turns to her little brother. It's so strange. If you don't have little kiddos, maybe even if you do, maybe they're not this way, but she turns to Augustine, 3 years old, she's 5, and says, Augustine, Abraham Lincoln got shot while watching a show. And then I kid you not, and I don't know if her mom has told her this, I haven't asked yet, but she goes, and that's why Daddy doesn't like us to watch a lot of shows. I'm like, okay, I don't like him watching a lot of shows, but not because Abraham Lincoln got shot at Ford's Theater. I don't know where that correlation came from. But then she goes on in the car to lament, literally, like decrying to her brother that George Washington and Abraham Lincoln are no longer with us. And I'm like, you don't even know these jokers. Like, I mean, one died from bleeding because they thought that that would help him. And the other, assassinated. So we don't laugh about that. And so you have Abraham Lincoln, you have George Washington, and she's like, they're gone. They're not with us anymore. They're dead. And I'm like, and we talked about, once again, this is Advent, so we obviously return to these themes over and over again. But when we specifically talk about peace, which we lit the candle of peace this morning, what we understand is that we have an invincible God who has condescended, who has taken on mortality out of remarkable affection for us. The immutable one becoming mutable, I would argue clearly that the impassible one becoming passible in flesh, filled with passion, filled with hurt, filled with change, grows up, conquers death by death. The immortal one dies and then rises in invincible intimacy to bestow upon his people that which we can't even understand, and that is everlasting immortality. So this is powerful. Like, we see the risen Christ this morning in Daniel chapter 3, the delivering Redeemer. And then just so we're done here, Nebuchadnezzar comes near to the door, which I love this because you gotta get the imagery here and you gotta read it through the ancient sources. Nebuchadnezzar, the king, doesn't come off his throne, but he does in this moment because he sees an invincible intimate, immortal king in the fire. Nebuchadnezzar comes near the door of the burning fiery furnace. He declares, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here. And then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they just walked out of the fire. And all the people, the who's who, the VIP, gathered around. And they observed that the fire had no power upon them, and their clothes didn't even smell like smoke. The hair of their heads was not singed. No smell of fire had come upon them. And Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, blessed be the God, Elohim, whoever that is, of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel, delivered his servants who trusted in him, and set aside the king's command, and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own. Therefore, I make a decree, any people, nation, or just so we're clear, this wasn't most likely Nebuchadnezzar's conversion experience. He's remarkably unjustified because he makes a decree. Any people, nation, or language that speaks against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb. Not the greatest evangelistic strategy, and their houses laid in ruins. Watch this, because of what I have seen. And just to be clear here, we make much of Jesus because he's worthy of being made much of here, but it was not just the faithful deliverance of God, but it was also the faithful devotion of his people that drove Nebuchadnezzar to this proclamation. There is no other God who is able to rescue in this way. No other God. And that's what we celebrate at Advent. So a couple takeaways for us this morning, we're done. Number one, we have a God who has invaded the fire, if you want to call it, of this world in the incarnation. And he has come out of eternal intimacy and affection for us. And he is the invincible, the resurrected one. And he is the one who is immortal, who gives to his people immortality. We have that. Also from that renews us with this hope and this joy and this peace in him during this holiday season, so that we in turn, even in the proverbial fires of life, can turn around and demonstrate to a watching world. I get it's hard. Demonstrate to a fallen family, to an irritating spouse, to unbelieving family members. Demonstrate to them that there is no other God. In spite of all the false promises we hear, work sets you free, do more, try harder. There's no deliverance. There's no other God who can deliver like this.
Right.